As a business, one might wonder, well, we are doing well to survive. But the real question is, why just survive when you can truly thrive? Thriving in the modern, chaotic, competitive business world is all about the intel and the insight. And here in BISNOMICS, in your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes, we intend to deliver just that, on a silver platter and in leaps and bounds. Welcome to BISNOMICS' today's episode. Our focus will be on the knowledge economy. The economy worldwide has seen many transitions. We speak about the age of agriculture, then the grand old age of machinery, the Industrial Revolution as one may call it. Then came in various other different aspects and dimensions of the economy. But the knowledge economy, in other words, an economy driven by the creations of the mind, well, that is a different dimension altogether. Let's find out about the potential of that globally and also in Sri Lanka. Where are we in this knowledge economy? And joining me for this discussion is someone who is very passionate about the knowledge economy and its offerings for the Sri Lankan economy, who is none other than Ruwindhu Perera, who is the Managing Director of Stax. Ruwindhu, welcome to BISNOMICS. Absolute pleasure to have you.
Absolute pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me.
Ruwindhu, knowledge economy. Lots of talk about it, but a lot of clashing thoughts and different schools of thought as well.
Sure.
Tell us all about it. What exactly does the knowledge economy mean and what does it include?
Got it. And Tarindu, I mean, you're not alone. I think for all of us, very candidly, it's an evolving view, right? And that's, I think, kind of the beauty of it is in many ways, I guess the answer is it's up to us to define what it is. And that truly characterizes, I think, the age that we're in right now. That being said, I think if you were to try and put some hard numbers around it and trying to kind of quantify this, right? One way to look at it is the global economy is about $84 trillion. And if you look at the three categories that they kind of put that into, it's services, industrials, and agriculture. And services, by and large, are kind of predicated on the knowledge economy, right? And that's about 60% globally. Kind of true for Sri Lanka as well. We're about 60% in the services business. But if you kind of more focus around this knowledge services, global outsourcing capability, and really kind of export of knowledge, if you think of it, right? And that's kind of really what is growing at a very rapid pace right now.
Ruwindhu, I believe this is about KPO, knowledge process outsourcing, knowledge activities outsourcing.
It's that, plus IT, products. So it's a whole varied amounts of stuff, right? And you're right, KPO, knowledge process outsourcing, some called BPO, business process outsourcing.
Yeah. IT, BPO.
There's multiple terminologies around
Exactly, a lot of jargon.
A lot of jargon, right? But I think a part of what we've, through SLASCOM and in the industry and globally, I think what it really helps simplify is to just think of, as you quite correctly said, it's leveraging your mind to be able to create value, right? So knowledge and innovation probably is really what best captures this. So the global number of this, kind of the value of exports, if you think about it, is estimated to be around $350 billion, right? That's kind of the total number.
And Ruwindhu, I believe it's growing at about more than 25%.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, to be honest, that number is also a very wide estimate because there are so many things that are emerging, almost seems like on a weekly basis, that really kind of contribute further to this expansion.
Interesting. Now, what would be the industries and the products and services that we could fit in within this economy, Ruwindhu?
Got it. Again, it's a whole range, right? I think so. One of the more obvious ones is, and what people know of it, is for IT, right? So information technology, around now one of the more later ones is around data analytics. That's growing at a very fast pace. But pretty much, I would say, Tarin, the way to think of it is any industry, when it comes to the knowledge attributes about it and being able to kind of, so think of traditional industry like tea, right? You'd think of it as a very kind of traditional agri-based industry. But think about the new growth avenues that we're trying to do with tea, right? There is a huge blend into the knowledge economy around now thinking about tea-infused, inspired kind of flavors, around recipes, right? So if you think about now how we're trying to promote tea across the world, is not just as tea as drinking, but really trying to kind of capture the imagination of people of tea infusion across multiple things. Now, to be able to do that, that requires your imagination and ability to use knowledge to really tap into that demand. So that all kind of characterizes around this knowledge economy.
And I believe, since you're on the topic of tea, a few years back when there was a massive particular Jubilee celebration of tea industry of Sri Lanka.
Yep.
The tea board threw a magnificent event where they served an entire 5-course meal, starting from the starters and the appetizers all the way up to the dessert, all tea infused.
Absolutely, right?
Now, for example, Ruwindhu, US-based firms or European-based firms sending their research work to Sri Lanka.
Yep.
And maybe what we are saying is sending the activities of developing strategies for them or doing the research work for them. All this would fit in under this, am I right?
That's right. So it's, and that probably candidly is kind of what the earlier wave was. If you think about it,
Also, we have multiple waves in this.
There's been multiple waves of this, right?
Which wave are we in right now?
Actually, people are kind of calling the third or fourth wave around outsourcing.
If you could explain to us
and
these
I'll
three
briefly
waves.
give you
Yes.
this, right? So I think the first one, by and large, was around cost arbitrage. You were really kind of thinking about on the dollar, right? It costs X amount to do a task in a more developed nation. Could you do the same task for cheaper in another country? And that was the basis of really how outsourcing happened. I mean, it's actually very phenomenal. If you think about how it happened, it was a confluence of multiple different events coming together that enabled this, right? And when you get a chance, I know you probably have caught it, The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman. It's a phenomenal book, going back about, I think it's about 20 years old. But really
true
kind
to
of
this date.
True to this date, right? If you think about what he predicted and the evolution of what was happening, right? So it was around the over deployment of fiber optics in North America to India and Russia having a fight, and the fact that they were so embedded in providing free education in India, so that there was this excess of talent, the immigration policies, all of them came together, and then the dot-com boom, the bust rather.
Correct.
Those three are fundamentally kind of what really drove this industry to take off in the early kind of, if you think about the 2000s, right? That's really where this really kind of started getting onto hyper mode. But coming back to the point, I think the first wave was by and large about cost arbitrage, right? I think the next wave was around, okay, that was a given. Obviously, I want it to be cheaper, but I also want it to be really good, right? And this notion of value arbitrage. So cost is a given, you have to compete on cost, but you also need to bring to the table a very differentiated value. And are you able to provide a distinguishingly different value that another place, a company, a person was not able to have as easy access to in your domain? So that is kind of what we're in and we're playing in right now. And all these three waves, Tarinder, as you can imagine, are played simultaneously. It's not like we've gone away from the cost arbitrage. There's a whole bunch of work that's yet to be tapped into that can be purely done on the cost arbitrage, right? So there is immense amount of work there. But then there is kind of going up the value chain, if you like, and then adding on to the cost arbitrage, also the value arbitrage. Kind of the third wave that's emerging is really kind of this notion of almost co-innovation, right? So you're going to have a situation where quite often the customers themselves or who you're servicing, there's so much of complexity and ambiguity around what could be and can be. They're looking for partners who can really help be co-innovators of that future. So you need to be able to help define, right? So think about it. Typically it was, I really know what my requirement is, I've defined it. If I was to do steps 1 to 10, the first wave was about, you do steps 1 to 10, but do it cheaper than I did.
All right.
That's really what the simplest way of thinking about the cost arbitrage, right? Yes. The value arbitrage was about saying, great, you know what? There's steps 1 to 10, but can you think of really trying to bring this down to 3 steps or 5 steps so that we don't have to do the unnecessary steps in the first place? So that's now about also value arbitrage, right? Kind of really process improvement, doing the same thing a bit better, more innovatively. This kind of, and it's kind of broadly termed the age of imagination, and we spoke about the different ages. Honestly, I think we're kind of tethering on from knowledge economy to really the imagination economy, as they term it.
Very interesting.
And really what that is talking about is now being these co-partners, co-inventors, and working with the client to saying, you know what, I don't even know the steps. Let's think of what steps should we do, right? And that's kind of the opportunity that's emerging right now.
A little bit similar to the garment industry as well, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the apparel, first it was, here's the design, make me 100,000 pieces, but you do it cheaper.
That's right.
And then they said, how can you do it in a different and better way? And now they're like, let's come up with a new design together.
Very true, very true. But if I may, there is a very distinguishing difference. And I think this, is really important to broadly understand of what distinguishingly differs this industry to some of the others, right? And I guess the simplest way to think about it is broadly you have supply and demand. I mean, that's how business gets done. There's a demand,
yes,
and then you need to provide.
And that's how economy functions. The two forces of the economy.
Very simple, right?
Yes.
Almost all the other industries are pretty much demand constrained, right? You need to fight to create demand, or you need to kind of enable. And we just spoke about the tea industry. Take an example, right?
For sure, yes.
It's not like there is so many people wanting to drink tea at unlimited pace, right? You have to create this. This notion of tea infusion is having to fight the war on demand creation.
Correct.
Right? Now, very different in the knowledge economy. There is umpteen amounts of opportunities and demands getting created very candidly without those who are in the industry having to infuse it. They're finding that the necessity is already there. So it's actually characterized as more of a supply constrained industry. So the knowledge economy, the key difference of this, and it's very important to understand that, is that the difference and the uniqueness of this knowledge economy is that it's supply constrained, which means is there is just not enough of people and knowledge and capacity to be able to
There is a supply
cater.
bottleneck on this.
Globally, not just us. It's a global phenomenon, right? And very honestly, for those who are coming in, it's a dream. Because think about it, right? I mean, you know that if you invest your time and energy to be able to get into this, you are going to be needed. You're going to be wanted. Now you have to keep innovating, right? What was
Upping your game.
up in your game. So the demand curve of this industry, there are different profit pockets if you think about it, right?
Okay.
So all the way from, it could be $1,000 a year that you could make by doing this, all the way up to $100,000 a year. So it's quite the spectrum in terms of where you could play, depending how innovative and invested you are in terms of upping your game, as you said.
Ruwindhu, I believe in another way to rephrase that would be $1,000 a year versus $1,000 an hour.
Precisely.
Who are the global players in this knowledge economy? If you look at some of the countries that have done really well,
Sure.
Globally, which countries have come forward as strong pockets of
Correct.
success stories for this knowledge economy?
Sure. I think the obvious is India, right? I think they've dominated in this space.
For decades.
For decades.
Starting with IT.
Starting with IT, right? I think it was absolutely, as I mentioned, going back to kind of the 1990s. That's kind of where, it was even prior to that, but it really took off then in the 2000s.
The boom in Bangalore.
Absolutely, right? So they've really dominated. I think, kudos, they've really helped drive the curve overall for this and been very innovative. But very interesting that you bring this up, Tarindu, because one of the most sought out global indices, if you think, or kind of assessments of these sourcing pockets, and kind of widely viewed, is A.T. Kearney puts out a report called the Global Sourcing Index, right? So it really kind of ranks all the countries across the world and evaluates, saying, hey, which country poses the best opportunities when you think about your sourcing destination? And India and China have dominated in some of these in the last while. Interestingly, this year, and the broad characteristics, if you think about what they evaluated and assessed, was around, I don't know the exact specifics, but three buckets were around cost, right? How cost effective is the place? What was the talent availability and the capability of them? And also what was the business dynamics, right? The business regulations, how easy to do. Those are broadly the three areas that a country got ranked and rated on, and then you kind of fell in. This year, they came back and added actually a fourth dimension and said, you know what, and they termed it the digital resonance. And that kind of spoke to about how digitally savvy is your overall population. How enabled is your environment around equipping and educating the youth coming in to really be able to take part in this digital economy. And the view was that, hey, it's a wider thing than just those playing in the economy. It has to be embedded into how the country functions, right? And they call this digital resonance. And interestingly, when they applied that, there was a huge shift in the top 25 that was prior to this to when they did apply this fourth dimension. And countries like US, UK, which earlier were kind of really low, a bit lower down in the ranking because by and large because of the cost issue.
Yes.
And this talks to what I mentioned earlier about the third wave, right? Because now cost is not so much of a deciding factor as much as your ability to innovate and imagine. And this digital resonance really kind of is an indication of the importance of that. And as soon as they apply this, you found that India, as the likes, have really kind of shifted down 10, 15 slots down, right? So these are really signs of all of us, I think, having to really up the game and really reinvent ourselves.
Interesting points there. We're going to come back to you more on that. Stay tuned. We will be back after this short break. This is BISNOMICS. Welcome back to BISNOMICS, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Our focus is on the knowledge economy, the potential, and most importantly, where Sri Lanka fits in this globally developing phenomenon. And joining me for this discussion is the Managing Director of Stax, who is none other than Ruwindhu Perera. Ruwindhu, now we spoke about the global potential of this. That's understood. You painted a very clear picture there for us. Let's talk about Sri Lanka.
Sure.
Where does Sri Lanka fit in? And what can we as a country offer to the rest of the world? Clearly, we are not as cheap as India or China for that matter. And we may not have the digital resonance, as you said, like some of these developed markets. Where do we fit in?
Great question. And I think, just to, on your earlier point, interestingly, we are actually still very competitive cost-wise. We're in fact about 10-15% cheaper than India right now.
Oh, wow.
Right? And what's more interesting is that's just on a pure per head count basis. But if you really waved in cost per value, it's even more. And there's a reason for that.
So for lower cost, we are creating more value.
Much more value, right? And this, very candidly, Tarinder, plays really well. I think in many ways, I would characterize Sri Lanka's journey in this knowledge economy having almost peaked at the right time, right? I think we've, it's about, I'd say 35, 40 years old.
Ruwindhu, are you saying that finally we as a country are in the right place at the right time, the right way?
Well, I'm a born optimist, right? And I'm personally of a view that, hey, it's up to us to create our destiny. And I think in many ways, this is definitely tailwinds for us. There's a lot of push. We're at the right time. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to be given on a silver platter or that we could just be complacent. A lot of hard work, a lot of, I think, execution more than anything else. Just taking the bull by the horns and getting it done is really required, which unfortunately is not our MO as a country, right? I think we're a bit more laid back. It could be the island mentality. And to me, we'll come back to that, but I think that's one of the fundamentals that need to change. But coming back to, I think, your question around where is Sri Lanka in this is, and I'll paint you a bit of a picture, right? So if you think of the top industries that bring in foreign currency, and then, I really enjoyed some of your programs that you guys did, in particular the one you had with Seneca, very informative, really helped paint with a lot of clarity about the problem statement and what we are ahead for us as a country, right? And then at the end of the day, that's what matters to all of us. And for my children and my grandchildren is, are we setting enough something for them, right? And again, I don't know the exact numbers, but it boils down to almost like a $12 billion problem, right? We spend about $25 billion a year. We earn only about 11 or 12 billion. There's a gap, so we keep going back and bringing, taking loans, and then it's a vicious cycle, right? I mean, that's by and large right? And just to kind of put that in context, that's peanuts. That 12 billion to 15 billion is peanuts in terms
of the knowledge economy.
In the knowledge economy. I mean, you have companies that are doing this. I mean, companies are valued 5-10 billion in 5 years of their inception, right? And this is something I think that I'm obviously, as you can say, very passionate about it, but I think we are at an amazing point in our lifetime as a country to really take this and grow with that, right? And our industry has done phenomenally well from, nowhere to actually have delivered over $2 billion, as we estimate in 2020, right? It's a phenomenal journey, right? And I think what's also important to understand, Tarinder, in that $2 billion is net retained earnings is about 95 to 98%. Now, I'll tell you what that means. If you think of the top industry that we tout as bringing in foreign income to the country, is quite correctly, as you said, the apparel industry, right? I think it's about $6 billion, has done really well. Kudos to the whole industry. However, I think something close to about 65% of that goes out of the country as imports necessitated and required to be able to deliver that 6 billion, right? And it's getting increasingly commoditized and hard for us to compete in this. As I said, because apparel also is not, it's a demand constrained industry.
Correct.
Right? It's a
Africa
crazy
is rising,
industry.
and then Bangladesh is coming up, Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of supply, but also the demand. It's not like people are going to continuously wear so much, right? It's not growing at a rapid pace.
Correct.
It's demand constraint, right? You've got to compete in new things.
And today we speak about virtual clothing, where without really owning the piece of clothing, you fit it into your picture.
Precisely.
Picture is on Instagram.
Exactly. There's a lot of different trends. I think, what hit me hardest about this industry was, if you think about it, I think it's insane. The shelf life of a style is something like 12 to 18 months. It's an industry that considers itself a perishable industry when it actually has a shelf life of practically about 20 years. A garment can probably last you, okay, maybe not 20 years, but at least 5 years, right? These jeans are probably 5 years or 6 years at a minimum, right? But, the consumer trends are changing now at an ever rapid pace, right? So it's a very hard industry, in short.
Yeah.
But in the industry that we're in right now, that Sri Lanka has been able to really emerge as touted actually by A.T. Kearney as the hidden gem of the outsourcing world, is that we really have, I think, got a right recipe of the right balance of cost, our thinking, and really being able to be a knowledge partner. And I'll tell you what that means is I think a lot of that talks to a few factors of Sri Lankanness, right? I think it's around, it probably stems from just being hospitable by nature. And that's given, right? I think, we're known as the island of smiles. People generally are very easygoing. And I think, if you think about competing, we don't, and I'm making generalized comments here, but it's a very easygoing culture to work with, right? I mean, you think about any Sri Lankan who has left the country, very quickly they become one of the most popular people in whatever community or whatever field they're working in. And that really has become an ingredient of success, as I mentioned, in this imagination economy of being able to really put aside the egos, put aside some of these highly competitive notions, and truly kind of come to the table and be a partner of thought, right? So there are many examples of this. I think that, you've had the likes of, WSO2 right now is a great example where we've really innovated and thought of a new way of how to do middleware, right? They did about $50 million on a path of being $1 billion valued in the next few years. I mean, just think about it. 12 billion, okay, $1 billion done by WSO2. Virtusa just recently got bought for $2 billion. Now, Sri Lanka, the ownership of it wasn't only Sri Lanka, but the genesis and very much the architecture of that company is Sri Lankan. The owners, the founders, the founding team was all Sri Lankan. So we have it in us, right? It's just about executing and making it happen.
Ruwindhu, let's talk about creating opportunities in this sector. Now, we speak about the talent, but I believe, for example, there are some fundamental requirements,
Sure.
ability to speak English, and some of this kind of basic skills are required.
Sure.
Now let's talk about the bigger picture, the rural. In Sri Lanka, 75% and beyond is actually the rural area.
Yeah.
How do we create opportunities for these kids, the ones who are passing out, the ones who are stopping school after O-level?
Yeah.
How do we get them to benefit from the opportunities of the knowledge economy?
That is a great point, and I think a very important thing as we think of growing economy, right? It cannot be concentrated just to one place, and there are big issues around that. And this again is, I think, why this industry is just so phenomenally amazing, because it is so indiscriminative about it. It's a democratized industry of success, right? And then to give you some sense, I think we estimate there's about 80,000 people working in the export industry in IT and knowledge services, which predominantly I'd say is kind of Western province focused. Happens to be up to now, right? And I think you covered this in some of your other places. COVID was a phenomenal enabler and just sped up a lot of things that were in place that took away some of these preconceived notions of physical proximity needs.
This is COVID's Chief of Vision in Digital.
Exactly, right? So I think anyway, of that 80,000 odd people that were playing in this market, about 65% were not originally from Western province. In fact, their hometowns were outside of it. So now imagine all of us, this whole industry by and large is now working remotely. So they've all now gone back to their hometowns. And now think about the power of economy that this creates, right? So now all of a sudden the average, average salary range that you're talking about in this industry is about 150,000 rupees a month, right? Now that disposable income.
Not bad at all.
That's pretty good, right? If you think about it, that's average all the way across someone who's just joining, right?
Yeah.
To all the way senior. And more importantly, I think the average growth rate of this is, well over 10%, 10 to 15% annual growth rate of what you have, right? Now, when that starts percolating and trickling within those rural economies, that's how you have the whole, velocity of money and the economy booming. So that's going to happen, right? But I think more importantly, what's also happening is, to answer your question around how do we get it to the rural areas, it's already happening. And things like English is a necessity, right? Very candidly, is kind of going away, right? There are some things that actually don't need English at all. And I'll give you an example, right? There is a company called GSS, which is out in Kurunegala, and I think they have branches well outside of Colombo. I think they employ something about 2,500 to 3,000 kids. Fundamentally, what they're doing is they're doing tagging. So it's a company called Trax, I think is who they service. Briefly, what they were doing was they were solving for what Nielsen's of the world used to do.
All right.
Of going into these large supermarket chains and being able to do an audit of whether the product was placed where it was supposed to be placed. Right? So a Coke can being first aisle, second shelf, prime location. Coke gave a discount to the retailer. for that. That's kind of how you did product placement in groceries. Now, how do you ensure that your products are available, right? Up to now, it was a manual process. There was a check, and every month, certain days, do spot checks, and then they kind of came up with the thing. Gone are the days. Now there is auto kind of drones to cameras, video footage that check and tell you and take this live streaming of information, and it's driven on machine learning code that tells you, is your product where it needs to be? However, the machine learning code needs to be trained, right? And that's called data annotation, which fundamentally is about taking raw data, which is not perfect. You need to train the data. So you need to kind of, and I'll make a simple example. You take a picture, as you can imagine, a lot of the competition also wants their competition to look a lot like the Coke can.
Yeah.
So they'll do very similar kind of nuanced designs and whatnot. So, if it's hard for the human eye to distinguish, obviously it's much harder for a machine learning to do that.
For sure.
And that's really what this opportunity is. I'm really simplifying this, but what the opportunity is they're using people to kind of look at these data sets, and you keep saying, yes, no, Coke can, no, it's not Coke, yes, it is Coke. You do that enough times and you give a training data set to the code, it learns. Now, this job's not going to last forever. There's going to be machine learning codes that do that for the machine learning.
For sure. But while it lasts, let's make hay while the sun shines.
3,500 kids completely outside of Colombo without any educational needs other than, I think they said A-level, simply because they wanted maturity and the legal requirements.
Yes, 18.
But they're making 50,000 rupees a month. I mean, unbelievable. Now, that's the kind of things, and that's why I'm very optimistic about it being able to reach the rural areas. The only thing we have is our mindset. The obstacle is, candidly, the thinking and not enough people really believing in how fast this can grow.
Yes.
And as a result, jumping in and investing into it.
Ruwindhu, does Sri Lanka have a proper government policy for becoming a more vital player in the knowledge economy? I see a smile. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm going to be candid on this and well, as much as I can, I guess. My personal view on this is, work within your sphere of influence. You cannot change everyone. And I want to give credit, I think, successive governments, everyone has done, I'm going to say it, as much as they potentially can based on their constraints, right?
But they haven't got a proper grip of the potential of this, have they? Doesn't seem to be.
Obviously not. I think there's a lot more that can be done. And widely spoken, people would say government should come in. I mean, you think about, and I'll contrast this, right? You think about how the garment industry took off, going back to the 80s, right? Under President Premadasa, who was fundamental. He believed it. He said, this is what's going to happen. He bought a bunch of industrialists, created the zones, and candidly, much hard ask, right? You think about taking electricity into places that didn't have electricity. You had to put physical buildings. These were highly capital-intensive investments that had to be made on the belief that this is going to do returns. And now imagine what it did to us. We are all lying on that.
Correct.
Right?
And we need to take similar action for knowledge economy as well.
I'm saying if you did half of that, we don't need any capital expenditure. You think about to get started. I mean, you and I play in this industry. But it just takes a laptop and a connection, right? And you're paying OPEX. Anyone that you hire, you pay end of the month.
Correct.
There is no capital investment to get into this industry.
For sure.
All you need, and I'll give you a simple example of what's needed, right, is when you talk about capacity, it's about training. And I think we need to change our mindsets from how we educate our students to being only through universities or colleges to how do we take advantage of some of the online MOOCs that are available. And if you have time, I'd love to be able to come into that, to talk about Coursera's.
We are going to come to that
and how that is something that we can absolutely take advantage of.
What potential does Sri Lanka have in the knowledge economy? Let's continue this discussion after this short break. This is BISNOMICS. Welcome back after the break. Our focus today is about the knowledge economy, the potential that Sri Lanka has in this sector, and what we need to do to really make this a thriving one and therefore reap the benefits for our economy. And I'm in conversation with Ruwindhu Perera. Ruwindhu, now you recently said in one of the recent discussions about how Sri Lanka is an excellent test market. What makes you say so?
No, yeah, I absolutely think so. I think, and this ties into the fact that if you think of the economy shift that's happening, right, and that's been in play for a while, but I think the economic powerhouse of the world moving from the West to Asia is just only accelerated.
Asia is no longer just the factory of the world.
It absolutely isn't, right? I think it's the consumption, right? Think about everyone's trying to serve into China. So UK, US, all the developed markets, if they do not figure out a way to be relevant to the consumer in not only China, but Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, I mean, amazing growth, right? We think of it as this downtrodden, poor country.
Not at all.
We just took a loan from them. And more importantly, I mean, there's no shame in that in my mind. I think they've done tremendously well.
And we should learn from them.
We should learn from them. And they have a huge redway, right? I mean, just the population dividends that they have. That huge emerging middle class needs to be served. And if the Nordics, the Western world is not figuring out how to serve to them, they candidly are going to be irrelevant in the next 20, 30 years. Now, as you think about doing that, right, it's not as easy. And, there's a lot of nuanced understanding of consumer trends, needs, how to serve into this market that you really need to understand, right? And then that could be pretty hard and daunting. Now, Sri Lanka, in my mind, provides, as I like to call it, a soft landing bed, right? Because in many ways we mimic very much that same kind of characteristics of Asian consumer in terms of what their needs are, their appetites, how they kind of behave, how they differentiate. So you have a very nice test bed in that sense to be able to understand, but it's not daunting of trying to go set up straight cold in a place like Chennai or Dhaka or China for that matter. This could be really hard to do, right? It takes a lot of, capital investment and conviction to be able to come in and make that happen. And we've seen that pay off. I think, there's been a lot of company examples where they've really used places like Sri Lanka to be able to test out their market and then from here launch and get into certain markets. IFS is a great example. And if you've heard of, it's probably the 4th or 5th largest global ERP, competing with the likes of SAP and Microsoft. They happen to have an engineering hub of 3,000 people, or close to 3,000, in Sri Lanka. Now, what they did was they were not aware of the whole ERP sector in apparel. But they tested that market in Sri Lanka because we have a very booming apparel market in Sri Lanka.
Absolutely.
We're able to understand the business dynamics of it. And in fact, they use this to now go, and their key market in this sector is Bangladesh. But because they perfected kind of how to be a relevant ERP in this industry, in Sri Lanka as a test market, they're able to now go compete very heavily in high growth markets like Bangladesh.
So Sri Lanka is the place to get the head start.
Absolutely.
Ruwindhu, let's talk about infrastructure improvements. Now, knowledge economy obviously thrives on having good internet connectivity, good telecommunication infrastructure. And do keep in mind, we have been ranked among one of the countries with the poorest of internet experiences worldwide. What are the infrastructure developments we need to make the knowledge economy a success in Sri Lanka?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think no doubt that is a key fundamental need. And I think, and that's areas where I think we need, as you said earlier, Tarindu, the conviction and the foresight of the government to step in and invest to what we need. It's just a base need, right? And I think if you don't have some of those, you're going to be left away and then not able to compete whatsoever. So the need for that, I guess the strategy and just the conviction of being able to invest as needed is something that is required. I'd like to think that things are happening, but it's never fast enough. And it just happens to be because this industry is growing so fast that you have to put it on steroids if you want to be relevant. So that's one key thing that we need to be investing more and to be ahead of the curve. But, sorry, go ahead.
Please continue.
But I want to kind of catch on this one other thing where, and I'm a true believer of what can we do, right? It starts with you. At the end of the day, you need to look in the mirror and say, am I doing everything possible within my means before I start looking out the window to blame someone, right? And if you think about getting into this industry and being relevant in that, there's so much more that every one of us can do, right? And I want to bring up this, Coursera as an example. Huge growth. It's the world's largest online university platform. It provides something like 4,000 different universities who provide some amazing number of courses, right? But the stats of this is insane. Prior to 2019, I think they had about 7 million registered students. That grew to 30 million 2020. They're estimated to be 79 million 2021. Unbelievable.
I just want to say in the first month of the pandemic, I took a fintech basic course as well. They said, 1 week you had the free offer, do it if you can, and I managed to complete it.
There you go. Karindu, you know, they just released a global skill index, right? It just came out about 2 months ago. Something like 85 million different data points. And they simplified the word, right? They said there are 3 areas of skills that they're going to rank the whole world on: business, technology, and data, right? And while I mentioned the likes of A.T. Kearney has been the traditional way of how people looked at sourcing destinations and how to come in, I'm predicting, and I can see that already happening. I do that in my own company right now. A lot of these formal needs of, do you have a degree? Is it a master's? Which university? Is it Ivy League?
It's going to be flung out of the window.
Means nothing, right? All that's required is, do you have the aptitude and the attitude to be able to be self-learning and be willing to invest on yourself on an ongoing basis? And the likes of Coursera provide that. I mean, you know how cheap it is. It was free in your case. Even if you were to pay for it, you know, you're talking about $150 to $200, and you got certified enough to actually go apply for a new job that you never were able to do prior to that. So this
sometimes
is
you
where,
can get these from some of the top universities in the world, but at the comfort of your own home.
Absolutely.
And Ruwindhu, I think what you're saying here is quite valid. Like, even for a student who is, for example, doing a good MBA program, yes, the MBA will give you a lot of value addition, will give you a lot of advantage, but at the same time, if you don't study anything after the MBA for a few years, you become irrelevant. So these kind of platforms helps you to stay updated, and what you are saying is, in a knowledge economy, if you are not updated, you are irrelevant.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Ruwindhu, on a final note, what are the entrepreneurial opportunities that young Sri Lankans are having in this knowledge economy?
Where do you start, Tarid? I think it's honestly, and I'd like to kind of say it's up to your imagination, very candidly. We mentioned about this, right? I think we've really kind of now moved away from the knowledge economy to the imagination economy. And to that extent, it really relies on how big a dream are you willing to dream. And I think that's one thing that I'm trying to convince my children and hopefully help them and enable. I think all of us should be doing that. And this is where some of our prior education methodologies have potentially come in the way, because it's been very rote, it's been very kind of spoon-fed, and we've unfortunately kind of yanked out this innovation and inert wanting to dream. So my ask to the youth is, dream big. It really is up to you, right? I think outside, plug yourself into what's happening globally, take the risk and just execute, right? One last thing that I'll leave you with, and this has been my philosophy, is think big, start small, but by God, act now.
Very interesting point there. With regard to the youth who are taking the entrepreneurial path in this knowledge economy, what are the common mistakes you see that they're making and which you hope they will avoid?
I think some of the common mistakes, I think, is just not really leveraging what's out there already. You think you have to do it on your own, right? This is, you know, our traditional way of thinking is that we need to compete. I have to do better than my next person. I have to get the highest mark in class.
And I have to reinvent the wheel.
I have to reinvent, right?
Ruwindhu, I want to ask you a question. Is this what you're trying to say? For example, let's say there is a student who is very good at teaching maths.
Yep.
Now he or she is thinking, well, I should build a website for myself,
Yep.
and through that I'll tell the world that I'm teaching maths,
right,
and let them come looking for me. But hey, there are so many platforms where these teachers can go and register, and the students will come looking for you.
Absolutely. Focus on what you're good at, right? I think there is just so much, and it's a ecosystem of partnership and collaboration. I think the key right now is find collaborative opportunities, right? Do what you love doing, do it really, really well, differentiate in that. Don't try to reinvent the wheel, as you said it, right? I think that's one of the, because unfortunately, I think while it's a very amazing time to be alive and there's so many opportunities, I want to pick on a word that you mentioned, the biggest risk that all of us, probably more my children and your children in the future, I guess, but is being irrelevant. We will solve, in my opinion, poverty to hunger to, you know, those issues candidly even today can be solved. It's a matter of access, right? The abundance of resources to solve them are already existing. We just have policy issues and greed issues and all those things. Those will get solved, right? You think
you're optimistic about it.
It will get solved, right? In fact, it's cheaper. The Nordics and so on have now realized it's cheaper to have basic income than trying to take someone through the whole journey of go to school, learn the relevant thing, get a job, be happy. They say, you know what, forget about that. I'll just pay you. Your basic needs are solved. Now, that's actually a very scary proposition. It's an easy way out, but what you lose is your freedom. So my biggest fear is if you go down this path, because economics will always find the most optimal and efficient way of solving a problem. And that efficiency will not take into consideration the human yearning and need for freedom and to be able to dream and to be your own master.
To let your imagination run riot.
Absolutely. And I think if we do not invest now, you will not be relevant in the new economy, right? You will survive, but the ability to really kind of get to the realm of relevance is getting increasingly harder unless you're investing on an active basis. So that to me is the biggest challenge that we need to kind of educate and equip our children with.
Ruwindhu, you are proud to be a Sri Lankan, and I've read this many places about your thoughts. Now, sometimes being a Sri Lankan is something that they say that we have this disadvantage, that disadvantage. Sure. But I would like to request you to leave our audience with the message as to why do you think being a Sri Lankan is actually an advantage in the knowledge economy? What is it that we can bring differently to the market?
Sure. Absolutely. I mean, I'm super proud to be Sri Lankan. In fact, fun point is I was born in Canada. I had to buy my citizenship in Sri Lanka. And I'm so thankful for the fact that my parents had the foresight when I was 5 years old to say, I need you to grow up in a place that you can be your king. And that's really what it is. I mean, I don't want to say that Sri Lanka is the best compared to anyone else. But if you are Sri Lanka, if you are lucky and blessed enough to be born in this country, or like myself, had heritage from this country and decided to come and be a citizen in this country, it's home. Make it work, right? I think there's a famous saying, I don't know if you heard, the grass is always greener on the other side,
yes.
Right? That's what the common term is, and we have this misnomer that the grass is always greener on the other side, right? So we're always looking over and seeing is something better. But the practical reality is grass gets greener where you water it. If you take the watering can and you water where you are, that grass is going to get greener. So to me, that's what I think we need to be doing.
You don't need to be going to other countries. Sri Lanka has the opportunity and the potential.
Are you doing enough within your realms, right? And to me, I think that's what we need to all take advantage or take to heart. Look in the mirror, ask yourself, am I doing everything possible within my means to make my environment better? And then everything else goes well, right? It's I think, the famous thing, if you clean outside your door, the whole world becomes a much cleaner place, right? So
fantastic thoughts there, Ruwindhu. Thank you so much for joining us, and good luck with the good work which you are doing in this sector. And hopefully, as you said, this sector, the knowledge economy sector, will provide the required answers for some of our economic woes of this country as well. Absolutely. Thank you for joining us, and wish you good luck.
Thank you for having me.
And with that, we wrap up today's episode of BISNOMICS. No matter what business you may be in, have a profitable week ahead. I'll see you with the next episode.